Hello. And welcome to Terrible Automotive Financial Decisions with Mark. I think that one's got the whiskey in it. Welcome back to Home Build Hot Rods. So last week we were working on the Mustang and found a bent push rod when we were doing some valve train work, and I was able to do a little bit of investigating and figured out what went wrong. So I've got two push rods here for comparison, and as you can see, one of these things is not like the other. So this is the push rod that was bent, and I did straighten it out so I could take some measurements on it. And this is the correct push rod. Overall length for the stock push rod should be 6 876 thousandths. The correct one that was in the car, a little bit worn, about 25 thousandths. But the other one was only 6 782 thousandths in overall length. That is a huge difference. Now the last guy that worked on this car and had all these push rods out and put them back in and did the adjustment really should have noticed that this was the incorrect push rod for this application. You know, that was me. So, idiot. So now that, you know, I've come to the realization that it was just, you know, my fault and not, you know, a result of some kind of huge mechanical failure or, you know, anything like that, we're going to go ahead and put the correct push rods in the car. And this is what we're going to be installing today. So these are a set of comp cams, high energy push rods that are matched to the roller rockers that we're going to be putting in the car. So, you know, we're just going to do it right. And these are all the same, which is great. And there's 16 of them in there, which is how many we need. So before we actually get into putting this thing back together, I do want to talk about the valve train on the 289. So there are two different types. So there is a very scientific and precise way you need to use to determine if you've got the rail or the non-rail style on your rockers. And to do that, we look at the push rod hole. If it's round, you've got a rail type. If it's an oval, you got the non-rail type. The difference is really in the valve stem height. So the valve stem height on the non-rail style is a little bit taller, so you need a shorter push rod. For the stock application on that, you would need a 6 804 thousandths push rod. For the rail type, you've got a little bit of a shorter valve stem, so you need a little bit longer push rod. That one would be the 6 876 thousandths, which is what we're going to be installing in this car. You'll hear a lot of times that, you know, you can do this based off of the date code. I wouldn't trust that in every case because it's not always going to be true that 69 and up engines are the only ones that are going to have this rail style rocker system. And we can prove that here. And we look at the casting for this engine, or for this head, is, you know, it's a 289 head. And the date code back here is 1966. So this is a 289 head cast in 1966 for the 67 model year, which by the 69 and up rule would mean this would be, or should be, a non-rail style rocker. But we've got the round holes, we've measured our push rod length, and everything works out to tell me that this is the rail style with the longer push rod length. So I got our new push rods all laid out. You want to make sure you clean these before you put them in, because they've got holes in them. There could be some debris down in there. Just brake clean and just, you know, give it a little yeah. So we'll get these all cleaned up and installed. Oakley dokley. So we've got push rods installed and they're all correct this time. So that's going to be great. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our rocker arms prepped to to be installed. So these, if you haven't watched the previous video, I mentioned they're a set of comp cams, high energy, full roller rockers that we're going to be installing on our stock iron heads. It's probably not going to do anything, but it could. So anyway, these do have a poly lock. So you've got a threaded nut with an Allen head set screw in it that will lock it in place after you have your adjustment. When you're setting these up, a lot of times your lock nut will come all the way, or threaded all the way to the bottom of that poly lock. Just thread it all the way out so that way when you put your rocker arm on, you can install it loosely until you get your adjustment done. Next thing is the roller rockers themselves. They have a trunnion and then they have a roller tip, and these both have needle bearings in them. You don't want to install these dry, so grab your oil can, or you can grab an old coffee can and soak them in oil for a little bit if you want to do that. Just make sure that they've got some lubrication, so we're not starting them up dry until it gets oil pressure. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do that to each one of these, get them ready to go, and then we'll get them loosely installed on those studs, and then we can go through the adjustment procedure. Just getting ready to pull my push rods back out and rethread these studs for the guide plates, and I noticed that I had a poly lock that had a different size insert in it, so I came over to check it. Sure enough, doesn't thread, doesn't fit. So new plan, gonna go ahead and put the original rocker arms back in so we can get the car running and get it out of the garage, because I need my garage back, because I've got a rear axle I need to finish building. I've got the Thunder Chicken engine, where is it? Right there. That's got to get put on a run stand and broke in, because I can't put it in the car yet because I'm waiting on parts. Speaking of which, I'm going to do a video on building a run stand, in the garage, basically out of like plywood and 2x4s, and that should be pretty fun. Alright, here's where we're at. Old parts. Going back in. So since we're putting these back in, we'll talk about these rail rockers just a little bit more in depth. So this is the rail style rocker. See how it's got a rail on both sides of where the roller tip or the rocker tip hits the valve stem? Alright, so if you have this style and you're going over to a roller tip setup, you need to use guide plates, because the pushrod holes that are round and not the oval shape won't keep the pushrod from having lateral movement, and then your roller tip can fall off at the tip of your valve stem and cause some damage. Even if you do have the non-rail style that does not have this, which is what keeps it on the valve tip, I think it's a good idea. You don't have to, but to put guide plates on anyway, because a lot of times the slots that keep the push rods aligned will get wore out a little bit, and then you can still have some lateral movement. So just a little tech tip, rail style. Well, I dropped the last locking nut that I needed to finish up putting the rocker arms on, and I have no idea where it went. I have been looking for, I don't know, 10 minutes, and I just... It's got to be here. Well, there you are. How did you get... Playing hide and seek. Hide and seek in the garage. No. Okay, so let's talk valve adjustment. Since we can see the lifters, we're going to use valve overlap to set all of our rocker arms using the base circle of the cam on what's called the opposing cylinder. So this procedure will work for any V8 application that's got 16 valves on the planet. And all you're going to do is use the firing order for whatever engine you're working on to determine what the opposing cylinder is and what valves will be in overlap, so you can adjust the valves on the opposing cylinder. So if you've got a small block Windsor that's not a 351, you will have firing order of 1, 5, 4, 2, 6, 3, 7, 8. If you have a 351, or excuse me, a small block Windsor with a 351 firing order, which could be a 351, could be the 302 Hypo, which came out in the 80s, or if you got froggy at some point and decided to put a 351 cam in your 302 firing order engine, you'll have the different firing order. So what this is going to tell us is what valves will be in overlap and what valves, when those are in overlap, will be at the base circle of the cam. So if I put cylinder number 1 in overlap, which means the intake and exhaust valves are at a certain position in the firing order, which the exhaust will be closed and the intake will be starting to open. So I'll have these two lifters in overlap. When those two lifters are in overlap, the opposing cylinder can be adjusted. This cylinder will be in the exact same position, i.e. at top dead center, just on the opposite side of the stroke as the valves in overlap. So if this is starting its intake stroke, or the piston is heading down the bore, this piston is going to be at the top of the bore, or at top dead center, and the lifters will be on the base circle of the cam. The valves will be completely closed. That is when you want to adjust those valves. So we'll do overlap on cylinder 1 to adjust the valves on cylinder 6. Then we'll move to the next cylinder in our firing order. We'll do overlap on cylinder 5 to adjust the valves on cylinder 3, so on and so forth, until we complete half of my firing order. Then we'll go back and we'll put cylinder number 6 in overlap to adjust the valves on cylinder number 1, 3 in overlap to adjust the valves on cylinder number 5, so on and so forth. This is really easily done if you've got the intake manifold off and you can actually see the lifters and where they are in their bore. I have another way of adjusting this, or doing the adjustment with the engine running and everything assembled, that I can show you once we get the car fired back up. If we get the car fired back up and nothing else crazy happens today, because I'm still mad about these dang rocker arms, comp cams, and your darn poly locks. So anyway, let's get over to the engine and we'll walk through this, and it only takes a couple minutes, and I'll show you how to do this. On the small block Fords, you've got cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4 on the passenger side starting at the front, and 5, 6, 7, 8 on the driver's side starting at the front. So the first set of valves we want to put into overlap is cylinder number 1. You've got your exhaust valve here and your intake valve here. If you're unsure of where, which one's which, you can just do a quick look down the exhaust side where the manifold meets the head, and whichever valve is lined up with that exhaust port is your exhaust one. So this lifter is out of the bore, which means it is slightly open, and my intake valve is all the way down. So I want to rotate the engine till my lifter goes all the way down in the bore, and this one just starts to come up. Now I've got a ratchet on my crankshaft pulley, so I'm just going to rotate the engine clockwise a little bit. I'm going to watch that exhaust valve go down. Alright, and there it is. And now, if you watched the intake side, you can see it just starting to open. Alright, so there's my exhaust coming back up a little bit. And as I go clockwise, my intake just starts to open. So this cylinder is now an overlap, which means cylinder number 6 is all the way at the base circle of the cam, and I can adjust both my intake and my exhaust valves on the cylinder number 6. Once you start getting close, keep wiggling a little bit until it stops tapping. Sometimes you can also just take your fingers and you can rotate this as you're adjusting, and then when you start to feel resistance, you just stop, because that's your 0 lash. So right there, I can still rotate this pretty freely. Rotate, 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 and resistance. So that's where I'm going to stop. Now I'm going to come over to my intake, and I'm going to do the same thing. Alright, so I can still spin, and there I've got resistance. Alright, now once you get 0 lash set, you also got to set your lifter preload. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set my lifter preload by turning my nut 1/2 a turn to the right, or tighten it by 1/2 a turn. And that is my lifter preload set. Alright, now that I've got cylinder number 6 intake and exhaust valves adjusted, I can move on to the next cylinder in my firing order and then adjust its opposing cylinder. So the next one in my firing order is cylinder number 5, which is our front cylinder on the driver's side. And then I can go back, once that's on overlap, and adjust cylinder number 3 on the other side of the engine. So once again, I'm watching my exhaust valve here, and I want to get this to start on its intake stroke, so I'm going to watch that exhaust valve go down. It's getting toward the bottom. Now I'm going to start watching that intake valve, and there, it's starting to come up. So I know that cylinder number 3 is now at the base circle of its cam. I can go ahead and adjust both of those valves. Where to put my darn ratchet? There it is. Threw it on the floor. Spinning, spinning, waiting for that resistance. Here it is. I think I actually went a little too far on that one, so I'm going to back it off. Spinning. There's some resistance. Nope. False resistance. Back that one off just a hair. Alright, so we got positive spinach, a little bit of slack left, and resistance. We're going to go 1/2 turn. Preload is set. Cylinder number 3 is done. Okay, well, now that we've got all the valves adjusted, I'm going to bring her around town, put her back on top dead center. I can't see anything. There's sandpaper on that harmonic balancer. She is dirty. A minute ago there, I was moving the GoPro, and I bumped the button on the light. Discovered that thing's got rave mode, and I about flashed myself into a seizure, I think. you're using a GoPro, be careful. Be careful. So these intake manifold gaskets that you buy come with these cork gaskets that go on your china walls in the front and back of the block. And the proper installation for these is to just throw them in a garbage can and grab yourself a tube of RTV. I prefer the Mega Black flavor of this. Got excellent oil resistance. Snipped. I like to put a little dab of this on the back of my gaskets. Is this directional? Yup. It says this side, towards head, so that'll keep them in place. So when you're laying the intake down on there, they don't slide anywhere. Now that the gaskets are on, put a nice 1/4 inch or so thick bead of RTV all along this front and back china wall. And make sure that you get a good sploosh in the corners where the gasket meets the block. That's another spot they might like to leak. This might be the ugliest bead of RTV I have ever laid. Pro tip for your RTV, after you're done with it, just give it a little squeeze until you get about that much coming out the top. Well, I screwed that all up. Let's try it again. There we go. And then just let it go. Let it dry. And it'll keep this stuff inside here from drying out on you. Oh, intake manifold. Going to be installed. Intake manifold bolts go in the intake manifold. So on the intake manifold bolts, there is a proper torque spec for that, and that is tight. No, I'm just kidding. It's like, between 15 and 18 foot-pounds or so. There's also a proper torque sequence. I always just start in the middle and work my way out. And I've never had a problem doing it that way. Well, things didn't go exactly as planned today, but at least the car is running. It's out of the garage. I had one last thing that I wanted to talk to you about before we close out, and that's that other valve adjustment procedure that I was talking about. And this is something I like to do no matter what kind of adjustment I do to the valves before I start the engine, just to fine tune it. It's really easy to do. You only need a couple of things. You need a set of old valve covers, and you need a depth wheel. You're going to take the old valve covers, and you're going to come up from your mounting flange about an inch or so, and you're going to cut the top of this valve cover off all the way around. And you're going to pull it off and bolt it down to your head so you can see your valve train, but you've still got an inch or so of sealing surface to keep oil from pouring down the bottom of the head and then over the side and onto your exhaust. I also have done this with just a piece of cardboard that I cut to shape and lay in between the ridge on the head and the valve springs, and that does help, but you still get some oil spilling out. Start the engine, let her warm up, and then you're just going to start on one side. You're going to work each valve individually. You're going to take your wrench and you're going to back off the lock nut until that valve starts ticking a little bit. You're going to tighten it back down until it stops ticking. That's it. And you'll do that for each valve. And I like to keep a vacuum gauge on my carburetor just to make sure that I'm not tightening down too far, because if you do tighten down too far, you're going to hold that valve open just a hair and you will lose a little bit of vacuum that way. So it's a fine-tuning procedure that I like to do. I'm going to do it on the Mustang just to make sure that I got everything dialed in the way I want it. And then if that's something you want to see in full detail, leave me a comment down below, and I can do a video on doing everything from making the valve cover the way it needs to be made, all the way up to adjusting the valves, checking the vacuum, doing the fine-tuning and everything else. So that's all I got. So end of another video. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you.